Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. In today's talk, I was going to cover planetary transits or Gochara from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective for the month of September 2023. And it felt like the overall theme for the month was hands-on leadership. So we'll get into that. Also, by the way, thank you to everybody who's supporting the channel, whether it's through watching videos or subscribing or liking or sending donations. All of that support is appreciated. So thank you for that. Excuse me. A note first, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And then you might take a minute or two to read the rest of this disclaimer. If you're new to Vedic astrology, Jyotish, or my videos, I have some tips for you. So all of my teaching, I have specific teaching videos on Jyotish, and they're all in my concepts playlist. And whenever you see one of my talks and you see a double asterisk, that means that there's a teaching video on that subject. To go through these planetary transit videos, if you're a beginner, you might get lost or confused. And so these are the teaching videos I would watch first to just get lay the groundwork for yourself. So introduction to the constellations or Rashis, north, south, east Indian style charts, introduction to navigating a birth chart, the lugna, also known as the ascendant, rising sign or first house, planetary aspects, natural, benefic, and malefic planets or grahas. And then I also have a whole playlist called Planets or Grahas where I talk about the symbolism of each planet. So, yeah, so let's go ahead. All right, so let's go through the dates for September. Excuse me. So September 2nd, today actually, Mars is entering Hasta nakshatra. September 3rd, Venus goes progressive from its retrograde position that it's currently in. On September 4th, Jupiter forms an exact aspect on Mercury. And then right after that, pretty soon after that, Jupiter goes retrograde. September 8th, Jupiter has an exact aspect on the Sun. 13th of September, Mercury leaves combustion, or asta as it's called in Sanskrit. And then that same day, Sun enters Uttara Phalguni nakshatra. 14th of September, there's a new moon in Leo in Uttara Phalguni nakshatra. September 15th, Mercury goes progressive from its retrograde position. September 17th, Sun enters Virgo or Kanya. September 19th, Mars has an exact aspect on Jupiter. September 23rd, Mars enters Chitra nakshatra. September 24th, Mars goes combust. September 27th, Sun enters Hasta nakshatra. And then September 29th, there's a full moon in Pisces in Uttara Bhadrapada nakshatra. And then right after that, Mercury enters Uttara Phalguni nakshatra. So that's what's going on. Those are the dates for this month. So let's get into what all this means. So let's talk about Mars first, or Mangal as it's known in Sanskrit. And Mars, again, if you watch the video on Mars, it represents things like action and initiatives. So, and also leadership, that sort of thing. So you can see Mars is fairly active this month. So today, September 2nd, Mars enters Hasta nakshatra. So again, Mars is a fiery sign. It has a lot of energy. It symbolizes things like initiative, competition, activity, and also things like siblings and enemies. It's in Virgo or Kanya nakshatra, or excuse me, this in Virgo or Kanya Rashi. Kanya Rashi means Virgo constellation. So it's going to be in Virgo all September. The thing, though, is that Mars is a planet that symbolizes enemies, and Virgo is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is not a friendly sign or friendly planet to Mars. So Mars doesn't do particularly well in Virgo because actually, in a way, they're kind of diopposing energies. Mars is a very fiery, erratic planet, like this photo here, like the warrior type, like there's a lot of, I mean, as heroic as they can be when Mars is well behaved, there's also a lot of chaos, right? So, and Virgo is a, um, excuse me, it's a dual earth sign. So what does that mean? It's going to be very practical as an earth sign. Excuse me, I'm trying to drink water. It doesn't seem to be helping. Um, just hold on one second. Okay, hopefully that's better. Anyway, Virgo is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is not friendly to Mars, but Virgo itself is a constellation or Rashi is it's an earth sign, so it's very practical, it's very pragmatic. And Mercury is a planet is a planet that's very detail oriented. So it's sort of like somebody who has a lot of energy in Virgo or planets in Virgo, that sort of thing. Virgo Lagna or ascendant, rising sign. They tend to be very precise, detail oriented, and organized in a lot of ways. And it's almost the exact, again, the exact opposite energy of Mars. So, yeah, so I have hiccups now too. Yeah, Mercury retrograde. Yeah, it was fun trying to do this talk or put this talk together during Mercury retrograde, as you'll see, because the charts that I go through, all of them were, I had to really kind of suss out what the real chart was. So anyway, we'll get more into that. And then the thing is that since Virgo is ruled by Mercury, Mercury is retrograde in combust most of the month. So that means Mercury is going to be in exaggerated condition. So these two are going to be at odds. Um, Again, not an ideal position for Mars. Could be worse. I mean, it's not debilitated. So, the other thing though is that when Mars is in Virgo, it's going to aspect Sagittarius or Danu. It's going to also aspect Pisces or Mina, and it's also going to aspect Aries or Mesha. So Sagittarius and Pisces are also dual signs. So it's going to be a little, it's going to be like two steps forward, one step back. It's going to be like, should I go this way? Should I go that way? With those signs. So Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. The thing that was luckily, in a way, Mars is aspecting Aries. So Aries is owned by or ruled by Mars. So it's going to actually make Aries stronger. But Aries is a fire sign. So, and Mars is a fire planet. So it's going to make it fiery. That also means that what's currently in Aries at the moment, sorry, what's currently in Aries at the moment is Rahu, which is a natural malefic planet. There's Jupiter, which is a natural benefic, and then there's this massive retrograde Swa Saturn aspecting Aries. So there's going to be three malefics in Aries with poor Jupiter's, kind of squished in between all that negative energy. And Jupiter is a planet that symbolizes optimism, so it might be really hard to stay optimistic. Although there will be action, so whatever Aries, whichever house Aries is in your chart, there's going to be probably a lot of action there. But that also depends on what planets you're running, what planetary period you're in, and also your own personal birth chart. Okay, so let's talk about Hasta Nakshatra because Mars is going to be there for a while. So Hasta Nakshatra, a nakshatra is a lunar mansion. A lunar mansion, there are 27 main lunar mansions, and so that means each day or night the moon is in a different lunar mansion or nakshatra. So by the end of the moon going through all 27 nakshatras, that means it's gone through 360 degrees of the zodiac, which is a lunar month. Yeah. So anyway, so this particular nakshatra or lunar mansion is called Hasta. The symbol of this nakshatra is a hand. Um, and so since Mars is a very active planet, it's a very hands-on planet, and it's in the nakshatra of Hasta, this is going to be a leadership that's very hands-on and also very nuts and bolts. Um, but it can also be very grabby, like literally. So, um, yeah, so again, it's leadership, and Mars is a different kind of leadership than Sun, because Sun can also represent leadership, but Sun is more the king, more the kind of head of state, which can be more of a figurative position rather than a hands-on in the trenches, nuts and bolts, like roll up your sleeves and work side by side with your employees type energy. But Mars is very much like in the thick of it. Um, but again, Mars can represent also things like thieves, and so you have hand here, so you can have people who are like trying to like grab stuff. And also Mars symbolizes it's a Bhumikaraka. A Bhumikaraka is a planet that symbolizes land. Saturn is also a Bhumikaraka. And so this might actually be a land grab. So especially if um, Virgo is related to land, which could be the fourth house of your chart, that sort of thing. There might very well be a land grab going on. So with Mars and Hasta, what does that mean? So it's time to roll up the sleeves, basically, and get to work. And also because it's in Virgo, I mentioned like detail oriented, Mercury ruled constellation. This is about cleaning, organizing, getting details in order, that sort of thing. And again, because it's a dual sign, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I already mentioned Mars is going to be extremely active. Um, so there's going to be much effort here, I think, without really knowing what's kind of having a clear goal or clear outcomes. Um, there's going to be a lot of action, but you might be feeling like you're flailing in water a little bit. Um, it's almost like a sink or swim type thing. Um, so yeah, again, it's gonna be a little bit I think frustrating in some ways in terms of knowing which action to take to meet goals, especially when perhaps goals are not clearly defined. So that's what's going on here. September 19th, Mars has an exact aspect on Jupiter. So we're going to bring some of this grabby, hands-on, initiative energy to Jupiter. And Jupiter is the great benefic. It's also, again, the planet in the mix of this Rahu, Saturn, Mars soup that's in Aries currently. And so it's going to bring this uh, initiative, this kind of hands-on initiative to Jupiter. So, and Mars and Jupiter, when there's a mashup there, that can symbolize things like the law. It can symbolize things like advocacy, because Mars is a fighting planet and Jupiter can be things like oration, law, balance, order, justice. Also even like children and stuff like that. So, and September 19th, at least in the United States here, we will be just starting out with the beginning of the school year. Most kids will, be settling into the routines and things like that. So there could be this energy of bringing wisdom to um, how to make actions go forward in a more linear or efficient way to bring about the best outcomes. Uh, yeah. So, but there can also be a bit of a jolt when it comes to balance because Mars again is so erratic, especially being in Virgo, where it's not very comfortable. It can bring this sort of jolt to things like justice systems and educational systems and things like that. So there might be a bit of a run-in there. Um, and then on September 23rd, energy is going to shift. So Mars is going to enter Chitra nakshatra. Chitra nakshatra is symbolized by a gemstone, and the deity of Chitra is the celestial architect. So now we're going to get into more structure. And again, this is going to happen right after Mars and Jupiter line up their energies briefly. So again, it seems like this Mars aspecting Jupiter will bring some wisdom and finesse into making this initial, what is it, almost 3 weeks of activity. Again, if you feel like you're flailing, it should bring some wisdom or even spirituality to this to make things move forward with more flow. And then you'll get more structure. Because otherwise you're just like, oh, what am I, you might be feeling like, oh, what am I doing? That sort of thing. Um, and then the thing is, at the end of the month, or closer to the end of the month, September 24th, Mars goes combust or asta. And so I have a whole video on that, combustion, planetary combustion. And so all this effort, let me step back a minute. So when a planet, very briefly, when a planet goes combust, it means that the outward manifestations of the planet are not really seen. Um, but the energy goes more internal. And so when we have Mars in Chitra, there's this architecture, there's this restructuring or building for a new structure or restructuring something. Um, but rather than it being outward, the drive is to go inward. So to restructure within oneself. And when we go deep into that, when we restructure internally, that's when the outer manifestations start to really shift and improve typically. Um, so again, whatever this initial enterprise is, looks like there's going to be it's not going to be smooth flowing until towards the end of the month, one feels this kind of shift to go within and reconfigure oneself, and then they can meet the challenge at hand and take better control of that. So that's Mars, that's actions this month. So here's our first chart. To bring some of these, I like to add these charts in. I think they're interesting to go through celebrity charts, but also I tend to choose charts that exemplify the energies that we're talking about for the month. So this celebrity chart is John Winston Lennon. So yeah, so let's talk about him. Oh, let's start with this chart. Okay, so let me just give the birth data first. So John Lennon was born on October 9th, 1940. There's a couple times that are floating out around on the internet about when he was born. So the time that I used here for this chart was 16:30 p.m. and he was born in Liverpool, UK. So another time that's floating around on the internet is 7 a.m. So I looked at both of these charts, and again, I think, I mean, Mercury being retrograde, all the charts, I don't know, for some reason, all the charts I pulled up, they all had conflicting birth dates. So it was like, so here I am, Mercury retrograde review, revise, details, I'm just like, yep, I'm in that energy. So anyway, I looked at the two charts, and this one seems much more like John Lennon. And I'll talk about why. So why is that? So first of all, when I looked at his just bio, his mom was fairly unstable, it seemed. And also his dad was absent for most of his childhood. So I looked at that. So in this chart, if we look at the fourth house, which represents mother, uh, it is a Gemini um, constellation, of Rashi for the fourth house here, which represents, again, the fourth house represents mom. So the ruler of Gemini is Mercury. And Mercury here is in a nakshatra called Swati. Swati is symbolized by newborn fresh grass that's blowing in the wind. And typically, what I find with people who have planets placements in Swati is that they tend to be a nervous, kind of flitting type of energy somewhere in them. Sometimes their whole body, sometimes their mind, but there's this restlessness, this nervous restlessness that I tend to see. And so if she was a Mercury Swati person, that would make a lot of sense. The other thing is that We have Saturn here in the second house, debilitated in Aries. It's retrograde, and that is aspecting this Gemini fourth house. So that's going to bring a lot of doubt, worry, anxiety, depression, mood shifts, that sort of thing to mom. The other thing in this chart is we have the same debilitated retrograde Saturn. So this exaggerated Saturn that's not, functioning as well as we'd like it to, it's also aspecting the moon, which represents the mind, which will reflect on John Lennon, but the moon also represents mom. So we have Saturn on both the house and the Karaka, the planetary symbol of the house. And this, again, debilitated retrograde Saturn is also on Mercury. So it's like Saturn is on all three. It's on the house, it's on the ruler of the house, and it's on the Karaka of the house. So that's a lot of Saturnian energy. Um, yeah. So I was like, if mom is unstable, and again, I think dad was a sailor, and we'll get into him. Dad was a sailor and was off for a while and disappeared, and then showed up, and then they fought about custody or who was going to take care of the kid, and John, and then ended up with mom. And then even though he went off with mom, I think at some point she had to gave him to her sister to take care of because she wasn't able to manage. So again, mom, there wasn't, again, not a lot of detail there, but clearly based on, John getting sort of passed around, mom was not the most stable. So yeah, okay, so dad, and again, I'm just clarifying why I chose this chart of the two that seemed possible. And again, even this, I'm not sure the exact birth time is correct because 1630 sounds like a round off to me, but at least I think the Lugna is correct. So even if the exact time is incorrect, I think the Lugna is correct when I went through his life. Um, so dad is symbolized by the ninth house here at Scorpio, ruled by Mars. Mars is combust. So we just in the previous slide I talked about Mars going combust at the end of September. So this is a chart with a Mars combust. And so what that means is the outer manifestations of Mars. So things like aggression, competition, leadership, um, innovation, that sort of thing. Um, and the houses that it rules. So in John Lennon's chart would be the ninth house, which represents father, and it also represents the second house of family, which he also again was didn't see much of in his life because his father was gone sailing and his mom was, I don't know what his mom was doing. I think his mom also died early, or was it his aunt who basically adopted him? Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of trouble with the family. So Mars combust, that means that he's not going to see his dad very much, and he's not going to see his family very much. And also because Mars is this erratic planet, his dad seemed fairly erratic. I mean, he was a sailor, but he just would disappear for months at a time. I think he disappeared for 6 months and showed up, and his mom was pregnant with another man's child or something like that. So, not around, not a stable presence in either of their lives. So that's Mars combust. And then what else do we have here? And then the other thing is we have two malefic planets. We have Rahu and Sun on Mars. So Mars is pretty beat up here. Um, and then the other thing about that is that, unfortunately, it kind of, again, there's all these kind of layers to it. So I already talked about Mercury in Swati for mom being not the most stable nakshatra. But look at this. So Mars, Sun, and Rahu, this whole circle, yeah, I have all three of them circled together here. They're all in Virgo. So Mars, I already mentioned, doesn't do well in Virgo. Sun is okay, a little bit better. Rahu, is okay. But all three of these planets are in a constellation ruled by Mercury, which I already mentioned is on its own unstable because it's in Swati nakshatra and it's got this massive retrograde debilitated Saturn on it. So all these things are going to be unstable. And also this group of planets, Sun, Rahu, Mars, are all in the seventh house of independent business. So the band was really unstable, right? The Beatles. That's, if you don't know John Lennon, he was considered the founder of the Beatles. Um, and also his relationships, which, if you know anything about his history of relationships, are very unstable as well. So unfortunately, this I think massive retrograde debilitated Saturn on Moon, Mercury, um, is also going to reflect on John Lennon because the moon represents the intuitive mind, the emotional mind, the sensorial mind, and then Mercury represents the rational mind as well as decision making. So even though I'm talking about his parents, these things also relate to John Lennon. So again, just looking at mom and dad and the lineup here, I was like, I think this is the right chart because if you take the 7 a.m. time, it actually flips the chart exactly upside down, and so it becomes a Virgo lugna or ascendant. And that was another reason why I chose this chart because in this chart the lugna is Pisces or Mina. It's a water sign. I think John Lennon was a very emotional person. And also, it's a dual sign, so it's going to be dualistic here. But that seemed more appropriate for John Lennon than Virgo, which I mentioned is an earth sign, very practical, very organized. It's sort of Marie Kondo, that Japanese woman who's been popular the last few years, and she's like a tidying expert, that sort of thing. I looked at her chart. I analyzed her chart last year, September this time. So September 2022, if you want to look that up, that video up. I went through her chart. And she is like the queen of Virgo. She's all about tidying, organizing, even your socks, rolling your socks like they're sushi and that sort of thing. So John Lennon did not seem like a Virgo lugna to me. He seemed much more like a Pisces, um, especially with his like free love and love the world type of 60s, 70s type of vibe, right? So, yeah, so let's look at his birth dasha. He was born into Moon, Saturn, Mercury. So already what I mentioned, this debilitated retrograde Saturn is on Moon and Mercury. So it's almost like a signal that there's going to be difficulty with mental, emotional things in his life. And then the Shah sequence. So he started off in Moon Dasha, and then he went into Mars, Rahu, and then Jupiter, and then he died in Jupiter. So Moon and Mars, those are very independent planets. So he was an individualist for sure. Rahu was ambition. Yeah. So especially with the Moon, we're talking about imagination, and then Mars, Rahu, and then look at this Mars, Rahu. That's all that seventh house independent business and relationship stuff. Um, so he went from having a very imaginative childhood to going starting up his independent business, which was his band. What do they call themselves? They had another name before the Beatles. It'll come back to me probably as soon as I forget about it. So so anyway, he ran Mars period 0 through 10 years, and then Mar. Did I just say that? So he ran Moon through from 0 to 10 years old, and then he ran Mars from 10 to 17 years old. And the Mars period is when he started the Beatles. Um, and then Rahu, that was the driving years of the band. He was basically 17 to 35. And then he died in Jupiter on December 8th, 1980. So I think he was about 40 years old when he passed. So anyway, again, I haven't even really gone through the chart that much. I was just trying to figure out which chart to really look at, spend time on. And already we have a lot. We know a lot about John Lennon, right? So let's go through house by house. So the first house here, the ascendant, well, we always start there. So it's a Pisces, Mina, Lugna. I already mentioned that dual water sign. So an emotional person. The thing that was like he's got K2 there and Revati nakshatra. K2 is an explosive planet. It's like Mars, but even erratic. And then he's got the sun with a direct aspect on it. You can see that bright yellow arrow going from sun up. And then he's got Mars on it. There's a direct aspect by Mars, so that red arrow going directly up to the Lagna. So Sun is a fire planet, Mars is a fire planet, K2 is a fire planet. This guy was all fire. But very emotional with this mental, I would say instability, really, or at least moodiness, potentially bipolar. Um, and then there's also drug use. K2 can represent that. So when we put all this together in the first house, what are we looking at? We're looking at somebody who's vacillating emotions. And then there's this contrast because Revati is a very peaceful, hospitable nakshatra, but Ketu's in it. So he's going to have this weird kind of contrasting dynamic of being very innovative and kind of in your face, trailblazing type, but peace loving as well, which he was. So he was both. And that's the thing of dual signs is that they tend to have these really kind of extreme contrasts in their personality. So again, all the dual signs are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. So, and then again, KT brings this energy of being unusual, separatist, explosive, drug use. Sun is in Hasta. So again, that grabby energy, potentially hands-on energy I mentioned in the previous slide. And Sun is a leader, so a hands-on leader or leader of hands as well. Because I think the hands was important to him as well because he was actually a guitarist. Um, and he was an instrumentalist in this band, so that makes sense here. Mars is in Uttara Phalguni. Uttara Phalguni is a nakshatra that represents things like enjoying life, amusements, entertainment, that sort of thing, the finer things of life. But there was also a purpose as well. So there's this rebelliousness, innovativeness, and the dispositor of Mars I already mentioned, the Mercury, which is unstable for various reasons. Um, so yeah, so you get this like emotional, fiery, dualistic guy, just in his basic personality. So then if we move to the second house, we have the Lagnatia here. So Lagnatia is Jupiter. Lagnatia means the ruler of the chart. And it's in Bharani. So Bharani is a nakshatra that represents it's symbolized by the womb, and it represents because it's the womb symbolized by the womb. It represents things like the cycles of life, like birth and death, that sort of thing. Um, Somewhat, this was a little bit surprising to me, and again, maybe this isn't the right birth chart, but the second house is Artistana. Artistana means a house that represents material wealth building. And that could mean like family, house, home, that sort of thing. Although John Lennon did not seem like the white picket fence type because of his actions, I think because of all this fire in his personality. And unfortunately, he didn't have great, I think, the most stable nervous system, frankly, to handle all that fire energy. Um, I think that's actually what he was really looking for. He was looking for family. He was looking for stability, but he just, as a kid, if you don't have it and you feel like your parents aren't around, it's really easy to be like, you know, F you, F the world. And I think that's essentially kind of the way he went, especially because Mars is such a rebellious energy. KT is like Mars twisted up and even more erratic. So there you go. The other thing here is that we have Jupiter in planetary war. Jupiter's exaggerated because it's retrograde, but it's in planetary war with Saturn. The Saturn I've already mentioned, that's on the moon, that's on the Mercury, so on the sensory mind, intuitive mind. Jupiter represents, especially when it's in Bharani, they're both in Bharani, so again, this womb, life and death thing. But the funny thing is like they're contrast. Jupiter's the great benefic, Saturn's the great malefic. And Jupiter, when I see Jupiter and Bharani, I think energy that brings things to life. And when I see Saturn and Bharani, I see things that, basically help people or things pass on. So death of things. So it's literally like life and death there. And maybe that's the way it felt to him as a kid, because that's what he grew up in, right? He grew up he was his middle to teenage years, 10 to 17, he was in this Mars energy. So this, am I coming or going? That's probably how he felt. Or people coming and going, in my life. That's probably how he felt. And as a kid, you don't know how to process that or understand people have their own issues, mental health issues, or I don't know, they drink or do whatever. Um, he probably was just like, it's me, I'm not loved. And, you know, he got angry about that, which is understandable. A lot of kids do. So I think actually he was looking for material security, like money and family. And again, themes and again, this Jupiter Saturn mashup, planetary war throughout his life. There were themes of like war, the war of life and death. Um, so that fits, and he spoke about that. He wrote about that. He sang about that. So again, there's this more like more shifting extremes in this chart. I was really just already like that much I went through, and I was like, wow, it's kind of amazing that John Lennon was able to generate what he did in his life, because this is a really intense, a lot of energy to do with again some fragility in the mix. What else? And the second house also represents speech. So Mars is also on the second house, aspecting into the second house. So Jupiter, Mars, again, that can be law, uh, that can be advocacy, and there's going to be this like forcefulness. There's going to be this um, really strong need to express, because again, Mars and Saturn together, when you get those two planets together, you often get somebody who has a lot of initiative but also stamina. So this is somebody who probably was just talking all the time, besides singing for a band. And I think that's what he was known for. He was very combative with his speech. He used to get in trouble all the time. Not only physically beat up kids, but like I think verbally beat up people when he was younger, maybe as an adult as well. Um, so this is somebody like you would never know what was going to come out of his mouth, probably, although it was probably punchy and entertaining. But yeah. But also this combination, also you have Mercury aspecting into the second house here. So that's his songwriting. So this is a singer songwriting, and then again, because of the Mars and Saturn represent things like metal and nuts and bolts and stuff. So this is singer songwriter instrumentalist is what you're seeing here in the second house. All right, so third house wasn't a whole lot going on. Fourth house I already talked about with mom. Fifth house, what do we have here? So fifth house, we have the moon in Shravana. Shravana, that nakshatra is represented by the ear and can represent things like music. So mind on music, imagination on music. And moon is aspecting its own house of Cancer in the fifth house. The fifth house represents things like intellect, creativity. So that's where all his imagination, intuition, emotion came through with music. The sixth house, we have Venus here in Magha. It's aspected by Jupiter. The sixth house represents things like routines and also enemies, and also lawsuits. So Venus is in Magha. Magha nakshatra is represented by the throne. So there could be trouble with authority here, although I think it wasn't too strong or deep of repercussions, it seemed like. His days were very artistic and fluid. There was some, I think, trouble with the law, mostly because of this Jupiter aspecting the sixth house that's in planetary war with Saturn, this unstable Saturn. So there were issues there, like he was forced to, I think he was deported from the United States and had to stay out of the United States for a few years, that sort of thing. And there were some, I think CIA or FBI, CIA or FBI files on him. So, um, yeah, because he was, I don't know, maybe because he was famous, maybe because he was a bit of a troublemaker. They were kind of watching him, I guess, to see what he was involved with. Um, Yeah, so there was some trouble there, but again, because Venus and Jupiter are both benefics, probably didn't get in as much trouble as he could have been in trouble with, considering all that he did in his life. I mean, he beat people up. Even I think even his first wife, I think, physically assaulted her. Yeah, so he's a troubled young man. Um, And then let's see. So seventh house, I talked about already a bit. So Sun, Rahu's in Hasta, so that hands energy. Sun is in Hasta, Mars in Uttara Phalguni. Um, and then the dispositor, the ruler of this sign, Virgo, is in the eighth house. So usually when we see the seventh house, it has all these malefics on it, and then the ruler of the house has gone to a negative house, which is the eighth house on this chart. And then we have um, negative planets like this unstable Saturn on the dispositor of the house. We call it a Drishkriti yoga, and that's a house yoga where that can indicate a lot of trouble. And so, even though there was all this drive because he was in his Mars Rahu years between the ages of 10 and 35, and that's when the band was really, going gangbusters, there was a lot of instability here. And also in his relationships and business partnerships, which is all true. And it looks like because of the Rahu here, Rahu can indicate things like ambition and drive, and it's in Hasta, so that grabby type of energy. He was going for it. Again, he sort of had this I think public image as a hippie and stuff, but he was driving the train. There's no doubt about that. It was interesting too when I was reading about him. I guess when the band finally fell apart, I guess he claims, I don't know what's actually true, but there's some story out there about he claimed that he actually formally quit the band about a year or 6 months or something before Paul McCartney officially quit the band. But he didn't announce it. So people didn't know because they were, I guess, trying to sign a record deal or something, and he didn't want to announce his leaving because he didn't want to ruin the record deal for the rest of the band. But then Paul McCartney, whatever, 8 months later, left the band, and he did it with, and even John Lennon, I guess, in some interview, he says, John Lennon did it the right way, like because I guess the timing of when John Lennon announces leaving the band actually increased record sales because it was like, oh, this is the last Beatles album or something like that. Um, uh, and he was like miffed about that. So John Lennon was like still competing with Paul McCartney about who was the real leader and who was, I guess milking the most out of this whole notoriety, celebrity status that they had. I don't know. It was kind of funny. So again, like that dual nature of, love is all you need. He'd sing about love is all you need, but he was a wheeler and dealer. Mr. Lennon was, that's for sure. Um, Yeah, so and then we move to the eighth house here. We have Mercury there, Jupiter, Saturn aspecting. So deep, again, the deep psychology. This is a house that represents deep psychology. The fragility I mentioned with the Mercury and Swati nakshatra. And again, extreme moods and decision making. You got these two, Jupiter and Saturn, opposite poles of planetary energy. One the great malefic, one the great benefic in planetary war, and this whole warring situation in this really um, what do you call it? Bharani nakshatras, a very life and death. It's dramatic. It's intense. Like it's all on Mercury, his mind, rational mind, and decision making. And so yeah, that's a lot. very extreme moods and decisions, and he would do some wild, bizarre things. So, and drugs didn't help. So, but just on his own, even without the drugs, this is already in place, looks like. So, ninth house, I already talked about that was dead. 10th house is career. 10th house is aspected by Jupiter and Mars. So again, this advocacy, law, he's anti-war, that sort of thing. And then also pretty strong singing, right? So the rock and roll and screaming, and sometimes like I think there's a story there about the song "Help" he wrote. It was literally there were so many screaming fans when they were playing concerts they couldn't even hear themselves playing music. It was like pretty amazing. And so he wrote the song "Help" because he literally was on stage singing "Help" because he couldn't hear himself play. So, it got that loud and that crazy. And then, they're singing as loud as they can and strumming, playing their instruments as loud as they can to overcome the screaming of the crowds. I mean, just that alone, even if they weren't like hard rock metal type band, for that time, they were. So that was pretty wild. But that 10th house, again, that's the 10th house of career. So there's going to be enthusiasm when you see Jupiter and Mars together, advocacy, singing law, strong, again, combative speech, rebel with a cause. Yes, 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 all of that. So, and then the 11th house here, I mentioned this already. You have this massive, debilitated Saturn aspecting the moon. So we're going to have more psych and mood issues, as if there weren't enough. And then the 12th house of loss, you don't see any planets here, but we do have Venus with a direct aspect into the 12th house. And this gets back at all his relationships. Venus represents socializing, loved ones, love in general. Um, and so probably the biggest loss he felt in his life was loss of loved ones. And then the other thing is the 12th house represents hidden enemies. So Venus in this house also represented the fan who shot him. I guess shot him 4 times, I think, twice in the back, twice in the shoulder, that sort of thing in New York. That's how he passed away. So, yeah. So also, I looked at the death date, which was December 8th, 1980, and we had on that day, Jupiter and Saturn were in what would be his seventh house. So they were in Virgo. And believe it or not, this blew me away. They were only a couple days away from being in planetary war. So we have this whole like extreme, uh, juxtaposition of Jupiter as a natural benefic with Saturn as a natural malefic in his seventh house, which is a mark astana. It's a house that can represent death, as well as other things. And this planetary war was aspecting directly into his lugna, his ascendant. So I was just like, wow, it just all is a full circle. And both of those planets at the time of his death were in Hasta. So again, that grabbing onto life, grabbing onto death, literally for him, probably in those last few minutes after he was shot. So wow, yeah, intense chart for sure. But that is John Lennon. And again, hopefully this is informative and educational in terms of some of the nakshatras that some of these planets are swirling through in the month of September, and then also some new planets. All right, so Venus and Mercury transits in September. Venus isn't doing too much, but September 3rd, I guess that's tomorrow, Venus goes progressive. It's in retrograde right now. It's in Cancer, and it's going to be in Cancer in Aslesha nakshatra until October. So there's not going to be too much going on with Venus. And again, Venus usually represents things like relationships, especially like spouse or spouse-like relationships, but other loved ones. It can also represent things like art and vehicles. So, but it's going to be an emotional time still because Venus is in Cancer. Cancer is ruled by the moon. So you have an emotional planet and an emotional sign. Cancer's a water sign. Um, with things going progressive with Venus, though, you might see you probably have a loved one or even yourself who's been kind of in a healing period. I almost kind of feel like Venus and Cancer is almost like Venus is in a cave, like a little healing self-care cave or something like that. And so Venus has been there for a while in Cancer. So I think somebody's probably starting to feel a little bit better and they're going to start to come out of their cave. And again, this healing period that they've been in or probably still in for a while had something related to was something related to emotions and home matters because those are things that Cancer represents. So Venus is going to start to move forward. So again, relationships, art, vehicles, artistic endeavors, those might start. You might start to see some forward movement there. Um, but that's the thing is, not to, you know, give too much away about October because October is going to be quite a different month. This is actually a pretty tranquil month compared to next month because next month we have eclipses coming up. But Venus, once Venus leaves Cancer at the beginning of October, it's going to enter Leo, where it's going to be aspected by a super strong retrograde SWA Saturn. So gather your strength, Venus, because you're going to need it once you get into Leo. Um, catch your breath while you can. So September 4th, Jupiter, there's going to be an exact aspect of Jupiter on Mercury. And that's, I think, going to probably be a good thing because, again, Jupiter's a great benefic, but, again, Jupiter has Mars, Rahu, and Saturn on it, so three malefics. Um, so Jupiter is struggling right now. Um, and Mercury is currently in Leo, where it's there with Sun, and Mars was just there, and then you have Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn aspecting Mercury. Mercury is getting pretty beat up because you have literally every malefic except Ketu on Mercury. And Mercury is a planet that can swing either way. If you watch my video on natural malefic and benefic planets, Mercury can go either way depending on what is going on with it. And so, because you have all these negative planets on Mercury, that's going to really negatively, I think, influence decision making and communication. So, and if you're a Mercury ruled sign, so if you're a Gemini or a Virgo, that also means that Mercury, if you're a Gemini Lugna, that means that Mercury is going to be in your negative third house, the third house, which is a negative house. And if you're a Virgo Lugna, it means that Gemini, this beat up Gemini, is going to be in the 12th house, which is also a negative house. So, if you are a Mercury ruled person or have a Mercury dominant chart, and again, Mercury's also retrograde in combust, so Mercury is really going through the ringer right now. And the things that Mercury represents, probably things like communication, travel, business, and commerce, are also not going to be in their best shape with all this going on. But again, everything's a cycle. It will change, it will shift. I just have to be patient. Mercury, I believe, is in Purva Phalguni, I want to say. I believe that's true. Purva Phalguni, yes, it's important. Mercury's in Purva Phalguni at the time, September 4th. And Purva Phalguni is like a symbol of that as a hammock. So swinging, relaxing, enjoying the fair things of life. So even though someone might be trying to be casual, lighthearted, yeah, enjoy friends and stuff, and attempt revitalization, there's all this drag from, again, all these negative planets on Mercury. Um, so with Jupiter aspecting Mercury, I'm hoping that this will bring some wisdom or spirituality or grace or some higher-minded influence to support Mercury and the mind, decisions, communication, all the things that Mercury represents, while all these negative planets are just swamping Mercury. September 13th, Mercury leaves combustion. So again, all of this mercurial stuff was mostly internal because it was combust. So all the decision making and that sort of thing has been slowed down and slogged. Again, it's like quicksand, I guess, is the word that comes to mind. With all these negative planets and Mercury, it's been hard to make decisions, move forward with clarity. And definitely it's been all an internal game with probably a lot of confusion. So there should be more clarity coming forward because also Mercury's going progressive on September 15th. So yay, Mercury. I'm looking forward to that for sure. Um, so when Mercury leaves combustion or asta on September 13th, we might start to see more external travel, communication, business, things sprouting up that way. The same day on September 13th, Sun enters Uttara Phalguni. So there's going to be some purpose, at least the Sun. There's going to be some purpose brought to both Mercury and Sun, because again, Mercury's been flailing a bit, trying to stay optimistic despite all the heavy negative influence from the other planets. And so I think just as a kind of a reaction to that, it's been trying to stay lighthearted, but it's been hard. It's been difficult. And so now things are starting to lighten up and move forward with a sense of mission. And then September 15th, Mercury goes progressive, so even more forward movement in the above areas that I've mentioned. And then September 29th, Mercury itself enters Uttara Phalguni. So there's going to be this sense of enjoyment plus a sense of purpose. And again, the so all these planets I've mentioned, I mean, we've talked about, Mercury, Saturn, Mars, Sun, Rahu, Jupiter. You've got to be running one or more of these planets. So we're all feeling this, I think, on some level. So again, there's hope for mercurial related things, I think, towards the second half of the month here. So the Sun, Surya, what's Sun doing in September? On September 13th, I mentioned Sun enters Uttara Phalguni. So whatever this new position um, is, there's going to be enjoyment now as well as mission attached to it. So it's not just attempt to balance all the negative planetary energies from Rahu, Saturn, Mars, that sort of thing. Um, and then a few days later, Sun enters Virgo or Kanya, so it's actually going to be entering the same constellation as Mars. For Sun, Virgo is a neutral sign, which is okay. But the thing is, and this is actually going to help Mercury, which I just went through, because Mercury is really getting beat up in September, but coming out of it. Um, there's going to be a parivartana, or sort of an exchange of houses between the Sun and Mercury, because Mercury is in Sun sign and Sun is in Mercury sign. So what that does is it creates, you can exchange the planets and their positions when it happens. And that parivartana is going to go on until October 1st. So that also helps to support Mercury in coming out of the slog that it's been in. Um, yeah. Um, but with Sun being in Virgo, again, we're going to have this practical, detail oriented energy. So, whatever this new job, position, endeavor is that we've been talking about, it's going to be something that they're doing by the book. And again, this might be because it's new that you're kind of crossing your T's and dotting your I's and making sure it's all done in a ship-shaped way. Probably because you don't know the lay of the land and know what you can get away with. That's usually how people operate, right? Until they know like what's absolutely essential and what can be, what's more flexible, I guess we could say. Um, but again, when we have Sun and Mars in Virgo, there's going to be a lot of energy here, a lot of fire, a lot of activity in Virgo. So whatever Virgo is in your chart, there's going to be a lot of energy there. And again, because Virgo is a planet Earth sign ruled by Mercury, I always think of Marie Kondo, this organizing expert. Whenever I think of Virgo, she seems like the epitome of Virgo energy. And again, I analyzed her chart in a video when I went through transits of September last year, 2022. If you want to look at her chart, but you might just go on a cleaning spree in your own home, organizing, filing papers, throwing things out. Organizing your closet, your sock drawer, all that sort of thing is potentially what this could all be. Um, then, just as a kind of foreshadowing of what's coming in October, what's interesting about Sun, so not only is Sun in Virgo and through the parivartana with Mercury also coming back into Leo, so we're still, in a way, we're still going to have Sun in Leo. So Leo is still going to be important. It's kind of going to be like, you think you're kind of moved on from Leo, but no, Sun is back in Leo through this parivartana. And then the thing is in October, the Sun is going to be in parivartana with Venus, and Venus at that time is going to be in Leo. So again, it's like Sun is back in Leo the last half of October, which is pretty wild. And October 17th through November 2nd, that period is when the next couple of eclipses are coming through around that time. So that's going to be interesting. Yeah, October should be really interesting. But in the meantime, while things are a little calmer, and you might be thinking, like, I don't really want to organize my software. If you have any motivation to do so, now is the time before the eclipses hit and all that kind of eclipse. Usually it's unusual sun shifts and changes that come with eclipses. So and the way that they're laid out, again, I'll get into that next month, but the way that they're happening is basically they're including every planet in the eclipses. So it's there's going to be a lot there. So while it's calmer now, organize your software, get your papers filed and all that stuff. So go with the flow, and that's what the energy this month is good for, getting things in order. Before it's almost like I was thinking, it's like wow, it's like here we're getting everything in order in September, and then October is going to hit and then, sometimes I can feel frustrated when I've just spent all this time and energy like organizing things and then just like somebody kicks over your sandcastle type of thing. But then I tend to think of those what is it, those Tibetan monks who do those really intricate sand paintings and it takes them days and they're chanting mantras and things and they're, using these things where they're dropping the sand in, where they're almost like drawing with the sand, super intricate, very colorful or whatever. And then specifically, when the time comes, a few days later, they intentionally blow the thing away, and they blow all that sand, all that effort, and it's all about non-attachment. So I try to remember that when I get attached to my organized, closets or whatever. Um, because again, it's all in flux and flow. We just sometimes our minds don't like to have more stability, I guess, than what's actually true. So then, okay, so we have got the Parivartana with Sun, it's Virgo, a lot of cleaning, organizing. And then September 27th, Sun enters Hasta nakshatra. So again, there's more of this hands-on, practical, tangible work and leadership, because again, Sun represents leadership. It's the king. If Mars is the commander in chief, the hands-on, CEO of the company, the Sun is the president, so the figurehead. And sometimes presidents can be very Martian in terms of hands-on but sometimes they're more like a figurehead. So more of that. All right, so here's another chart to exemplify the energies going on. So this celebrity chart is for Pele. So the phenomenal soccer player from Brazil. And again, Mercury retrograde for me as an astrologer, I had to check his birth data. So officially his birthday is October 21st, 1940, and the birth time is 3 a.m. and he was born in Três Furacões in Brazil. But there's also the date out there. The time is the same. Usually the time is different, but the date is the same. For him, there was a date difference, and the date difference came from his autobiography. So in his own autobiography, he listed his birthday as 23rd of October, 1940. So then I was like, okay, which one? Which one do I think is correct? So I have to like, it's funny. It's almost like every chart I looked at, I had to do twice. So again, Mercury retrograde. What are you gonna do? Go with the flow. But I learned a lot, so that's good. Why did I choose this chart? So first of all, his birth dasha, he's born into Jupiter, Mercury, Venus. And this guy has Venus in his lugna, and he has this retrograde Jupiter aspecting into the lugna. Um, so this is he was a very high-minded person, well-loved, social, and that's part of why he, even after all of his soccer, people loved him as a soccer player, and even after that, he became like the Goodwill ambassador and things like that, and that's why. So he was just you have Jupiter, Mercury, Venus here. That's a really good sign for somebody's life and the energy they're going to grow into. But also part of why I um, chose this chart, so the 23rd October date instead of the 21st October date, is that he retired in 1977, which would have been his Mercury Dasha, his Mercury planetary period. And in the D10, so that's a subzodiac of his chart. And the D10 represents the career. Mercury was in 6B, the sixth house, which is a negative house. And up until then, because he ran Jupiter and then he ran Saturn. So Jupiter and Saturn were his, especially Saturn was his like, massive athletic period time. But then in 1977, he retired from soccer. Well, he still played, but not on the national team, I think. Um, so there was a downshift in his career essentially after that. So that lines up. You only get Mercury in the sixth house of the D10 with the October 23rd date. You don't get that with the October 21st date. And again, 3 o'clock is probably not exactly 3 o'clock, but it was an estimate. So how far off of that, who knows? But so that was one thing. And then the other thing is that 1977, so also looking at using the options to try to rectify or figure out if this was the right lugna. At least, again, I'm not sure it's the right exact birth time, but at least the right lugna or ascendant. In 1977, he also had a kidney transplant. So then I went looking for his health stuff, and I went to the D8, which is a subzodiac or amsha for chronic illness. And once he was in Mercury, because after Mercury, you go Mercury, Venus, K2, Dasha. Mercury, Venus, K2 were all in negative houses in the D8. So chronic disease really plagued this guy after 1977, and maybe that was part. I'm guessing that was part of why he decided to retire. I don't know. I don't know if his career was slumping or if his health was slumping, but it looks like definitely his health, if not both. And maybe it was maybe which came first. Was it like he was working so hard as an athlete, it stressed out his kidneys, or was it his kidneys weren't working well, and so he couldn't function that well as an athlete? Because if he needed a kidney transplant, I mean, that's pretty serious. Yeah, pretty slow, really a devitalized kidney function to need a transplant rather than just slow down himself. But you can't slow down if you're a massive soccer or internationally renowned soccer player. You can't really slow down, right? It doesn't go well with the fans. They want to see action, right? So all right. The other thing, which is also, I think, super important for choosing this chart, was Mars itself. So Mars represents things like athletics. And in the 21st October chart, Mars is in the second house. So that's the same in both here. But just the 2 days, with 2 days of time, Mercury goes from the third house in October 1st, 21st to fourth house, which you see in this chart on October 23rd. So on October 23rd, but not October 21st, you get a parivartana between Mars and Mercury. And so what that means is when you get the parivartana, especially because Mars has special aspects, and I mentioned I have a whole video on aspects if you want to learn about that. What that means is you can exchange Mars and Mercury, and so Mars on its own without a parivartana aspects directly into the house across from it, and then has special aspects 4 houses away and 8 houses away. When you do the parivartana, now you get Mars aspecting in this chart 3 more houses and is in a different position. And if you don't have this parivartana, Mars doesn't really touch the career. It doesn't touch the 10th house, which is career. It doesn't touch the 7th house of independent business, which, usually one of those two is strong for somebody, who's this, historically world renowned soccer player. Um, yeah, so I was really shocked that somebody who's that famous as an athlete didn't really have a strong Mars, which is what I saw when I first looked at the October 21st chart. But then when I saw the October 23rd, I was like, okay, this makes a little bit more sense, I think. So those are the reasons why I chose October 23rd, in terms of verifying his life history and stuff like that. So let's go through chart house by house. So the first house, again, the ascendant, he's a Leo, Simha, Lugna ascendant, and Purva Phalguni. The symbol of that is a hammock. So uh, that's a lot of energy around enjoying life and the finer things of life, having a good time, enjoyment. Leo is a fixed fire sign. So this is somebody who is oh, unlike John Lennon, and John Lennon was only born a few weeks before Pele here. They were born in the same year, same month. Um, this is going to be a fiery person, but for different reasons than John Lennon was fiery. Um, and also, this is more fixed. So this is somebody who's going to be more stable, more consistent in their ways. So it's almost in some ways just by being fixed, it's almost the opposite of being a dual sign, which John Lennon looked like he was a Pisces, Lugna. Um, so fire sign active, passionate, strong personality. Um, and somebody, the fifth house is usually or not the fifth house, but Leo usually as a place represents a stage. And he was on the world stage from his teenage years. He got on the national team, I think when he was 15 or 16, or the national Brazil team, soccer team. And then even after that, even after he retired from soccer, he didn't just, drift into the shadows. He was a goodwill ambassador and he was the minister of sports for Brazil and he was always out there, in the public light. So, um, the thing also, this is strong because there's a parivartan exchange of houses between Venus and the sun. So sun goes back into Leo, which is what I mentioned. We're going to have a parivartana of sun and Venus in October. So you see it here in his chart. Um, so the sun represents again the king, president. Yes, Venus represents socializing and that sort of thing. Sun is also in Chitra. So this is when you combine all these energies together. Somebody who loves fun, enjoys life, is kind of a playboy, and not it doesn't have to be. I'm pretty sure he was really into women. So I don't mean like a womanizer. I don't know if that's the case, but I don't really look at that. But just somebody who likes to have fun and enjoy life and was full of life, that sort of thing. And that's probably why people liked him so much. Because you can have soccer players who are amazing, who people just like to hate on, and that wasn't this guy. Everybody loved Pele, I think. Somebody's like and also you have this Jupiter, retrograde Jupiter, aspecting onto Venus. So Jupiter's a great benefic. Venus is always a benefic. I mean, this is going to be a well-liked guy, life of the party, deeply benevolent guy, um, and a leader. So, and I mean, I would rather have, I think, a leader who was benefic, in this sort of way than somebody who was just a despot or something like that. Um, this is president that you're going to want to like, I think. And that's what he was, I think. So, second house, if we look there, we have Mars and Rahu both in Hasta. So again, that grabby energy. And yeah, he grabbed onto life. He grew up in poverty, but very quickly rose up through life, made a lot of money. The other thing is when you have this parivartana between Mars and Mercury, that means Mercury is going to be in its own sign in the second house. So that's the house related to savings. So that's going to help with money in his life. And when Mercury is swa in its or in its own sign in Virgo in the second house, his 11th house, which is his income, is also going to be boosted because Mercury's strong. So that's nice. So again, that parivartana between Mars and Mercury, which helped me choose this chart, also helps with his money, which I'm sure he made plenty of in his life, with all his endeavors. And Mercury's in Vishaka. Vishaka is a nakshatra that's symbolized by a victory arch. Sometimes, though, they can get into trouble, especially with Mercury representing things like communication. It might be that his mouth got the better of him and he got into trouble because he wasn't his speech, even though his nature, his personality was diplomatic with his Venus and Jupiter in the Lagna. It might be that his speech was not always so eloquent. Yes, so and he might have gotten in trouble with some of the things he said. Um, but Mars, leadership, innovative, Rahu, ambition, drive. There's an ambition to be a successful speaker. Also, we have, I think there's something else going on here. No, I guess not. And so, and that's what he was. He was essentially a vocal advocate for things like the environment, even. Um, and Mars can represent the environment, so he advocated for the environment, that sort of thing. So, besides people and the poor and all that sort of thing. So, um, yeah. And also, when I countered it up, when you do this exchange between Mercury and Mars, if you take the October 23rd chart, then Mars is in or on 8 houses out of 12. So this Martian energy is going to be pretty dominant, and it's on 6 planets. So then I can see, okay, now we've got, an athlete here, like a world-renowned athlete, who goes down in history, that sort of thing. All right, then the third house here, we have Sun and Venus, again, leadership and socializing. But you do have a debilitated Saturn and Jupiter, both in Bharani, again, because this is only a few weeks away from John Lennon's chart, bird chart. And Saturn and Jupiter are both slow moving planets. So again, you have Saturn and Jupiter in planetary war in Bharani. So Sun, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, and these configurations in the third house, those energies, we're going to get somebody who's head of crafting speech, eloquent, and eloquent, uh, crafting speech about eloquently about unsavory matters. Because again, you have this debilitated, exaggerated retrograde Saturn. So, things like poverty, things like bureaucracy, and those are things he all came up against and spoke about. And again, sometimes got him into trouble. But this is also, again, with the Venus there, the Jupiter there on the speech. I think for the most part, once he found his way, he learned probably through some training to speak more eloquently about things to gather support for his causes. And that's why he became a goodwill ambassador. Because if you're, you know, I mean, in his own way, I guess in his own, anti-conventional way, John Lennon was a goodwill ambassador, but he never got paid for it. He never got, he's like, oh, John Lennon's our goodwill ambassador, because he was so unstable. And so you never knew what was going to come out of his mouth. And that was just his nature. I mean, he was not only Martian the way that Pele's Martian, but Pele at least has Venus and Jupiter in his lugna to temper and smooth out all that Martian energy. Or as John Lennon had Mars and Rahu, Ketu, Sun, all on the Lugna. I mean, that's like, wow, again, a lot. Besides the instability I mentioned in John Lennon. So again, these guys were born 3 weeks apart, but you can see, and they're both leaders, world-renowned, famous, historically famous leaders, but completely different. Yeah, so what a difference a few days makes. Uh, yeah, so fourth house, Mars, Mercury there, probably a very strong, headstrong mother. Probably also her speech, communication may have gotten the better of her at times because she had that Vishaka Mercury there. But I didn't get much details about mom and dad, so I couldn't really use that with helping me figure out whether this is the right chart or not. But again, when I went through other aspects of his life, other events in his life, this seemed to work. The fifth house, you have Mars aspecting, Jupiter, Moon. I didn't actually put all the arrows for all these like I normally do because I mostly wanted you to see all these red arrows coming from Mars. So we have this filled in bright red lines, three of them arrows from Mars, and those are the aspects that Mars has from that original position. Then I put in here an extra Mars in the fourth house because of that parivartana, so you can actually see it because I don't usually do that. And then I have the dotted three lines, dotted three arrows from that second Mars showing you where Mars is so that you could actually see all the red arrows and all, and everything that Mars touches when you do the parivartana and why that was so important, I think, for this chart. So I missed some of the arrows, but that's so that you can more clearly see the Mars influence. So the fifth house, so intellect, creativity, Mars, Jupiter, Moon, leader, innovative, public defender. Yes, yes, yes. Sixth house, Saturn aspects into there. Saturn is aspecting into its own sign. So this is going to be somebody who has very disciplined routines and also some strong enemies. Yeah. In the seventh house, you have Mars aspecting Jupiter, Moon. So again, leader, innovative, public defender, and a lot of enthusiasm. Again, the guy was just beaming with energy. Um, I don't even know. I never really read about Pele. I just knew he was a soccer player from Brazil. I didn't know anything else. But once, even just a few pictures, you can just see he's like the sun itself, just generating, buzzing with energy. It seems like. Um, but Mars, and then so seventh house, Mars, Venus, Sun, aspecting into this house. So passionate about independent business and relationships, and his career. Mars, Sun, again, leadership and his independent business career. The eighth house of usually deep psychology, but it can also medically it can represent things like urinary system, kidneys, bladder, as well as the hidden sexual organs for somebody. And we have K2 and Revati, which is gentle energy, but again, there's this K2 is planet that can represent things that are hidden or unexpected and unusual. And then we have Mars. Mars represents the urinary system, so that doubles up on the meaning of that house. And Mars can represent things like surgery. Mars can represent things like kidneys. And then when we do the Parivartana, um, Mercury is also in here as well. So that's where we get things like kidney disease. He had the kidney transplant as well as he had colon cancer at the end of his life. So these planets here can represent things like that. Um, and then the ninth house, he has this debilitated Saturn retrograde and planetary war with Jupiter retrograde. He's got Mars on this house. This is actually interesting here because this Aries, this is all in Aries. So this Aries in his chart is very much like our Aries now because we have Jupiter and Aries now. We don't have Saturn there, but we have Saturn aspecting from Aquarius into that house. And then we have Mars in Virgo. So that's also another reason why I chose this chart just as a teaching tool or teaching experience because again the energies there's some similarities in the energies with the current sky pattern. So in the ninth house, you have debilitated Saturn, you have Jupiter, planetary war, Sun, Venus, Mars. This is, I think, so you have basically what, five planets, sending their energy here. This is, I think, why he became a diplomat, essentially later, an ambassador later in life. In a government position, he'd fight for the poor, fight for land, fight for the underdog. His father was a strong figure, but also there's some contentiousness here and some because especially because of this planetary war and this debilitated retrograde Saturn. But I think because of the Jupiter, Venus, Mars, so Saturn and Mars is going to give him tenaciousness. Jupiter and Venus is going to give him the ability to make inroads through relationships. So I think that's why he was able to become like the minister of sports for Brazil because he was liked enough, his relationships were strong enough, he was tenacious enough, and he was a good-minded person. I mean, he could have just, he didn't have to go that way. He could have just sat at home and counted his money. He didn't have to. After he retired from soccer, he's like, I'm just going to sit at home and count my money. No, he was using his influence and his notoriety as celebrity to help, I think. Kind of reminded me of Audrey Hepburn. Once she retired from acting, she basically was a goodwill ambassador, that sort of thing. So the 10th house of career, we have Mars and Mercury aspecting in here when you do the parivartana. So Mars and Mercury, when you have those together, Mars is athletics and Mercury's games. So athletic games. Hello, there you go. And then the 11th house, we have the moon here in Punarvasu. So the mind, usually Punarvasu is there's a sharpness to it because it's symbolized by a quiver of arrows. So the point of the arrow. Um, and it's something, Punarvasu is a high-minded type of nakshatra. Um, and you have Mars aspecting on here when you do the parivartana. You also have Saturn, this debilitated Saturn on the moon. So this is somebody who's going to have a very tenacious mind because this is not just like an athlete of the body, but this is somebody who's an athlete of the mind because you have Mars, it's kind of the initiator, and Saturn, which is the perseverance, and you put them together, and somebody who's not gonna, their mind is not gonna stop. Um, and Moon is in the 11th house of income. It's also in the 11th house of clubs, groups, societies. So this is, this is going to be somebody who's interested in public, established sports clubs and that sort of thing. The thing though is that this somewhat like Lennon's chart, but not exactly, because again, you don't have all the other confluent things related to like drugs and uh, like Saturn isn't on. Let me just double check. Saturn here isn't on Mercury. It's only on the Moon. But there was going to be some difficulty in childhood because again, Saturn retrograde here is in the 19th degree of Aries, so it's going to go retrograde. I don't know how long, and then eventually, probably in a few months, maybe a year at most, it's going to go into Taurus here. Once it's in Taurus, this person is going to be officially in Sati Sati. So Sati Sati again is a 7.5 year period when Saturn goes through the constellation before, through, and after the moon. And it's typically a time when people lose support systems. There are going to be other things too, but that's the one major commonality of that experience. Um, but he was almost born into Sati Sati. So the first 10 years of his career, of his life, were going to be difficulty, and he was born into poverty. Like apparently his first football, I think someone took like a sock, filled up the sock and tied it with some string, and he kicked that around. That was his first football, that sort of thing. So I don't think he had it easy the first few years of his life, but look at where he ended up. So that is Pele. All right. So actually, Jupiter, guru in Sanskrit, is moving around a bit in September. And I think that's actually good. It's going to lift up some of these heavier energies that are going on this month, and especially give us a little bit of space and breathing room, maybe a little bit of revitalization before October comes, because that's going to be probably pretty intense from the first glance of it. So Jupiter is the great benefic. I do have a video on benefic malefic planets. You can check that out if you're interested in more info on that. But Jupiter represents things like grace, ordination, education, publication, law, teachers, high-minded stuff. Banks too. September 24th, I mentioned Jupiter has an exact aspect on Mercury. So Jupiter represents the teacher, and Mercury represents the students. So you could actually get like a teacher versus student incident. It's also Jupiter represents wisdom, Mercury represents intelligence. So it's sort of like, which are you going to use for a particular in a particular moment? Jupiter and Mercury also together. Jupiter represents law, and Jupiter and Mercury together generally represent things like mass media. So you might see some maybe these sorts of issues coming up in the news, that sort of thing. But Jupiter is also a planet that represents expansion, so it might actually help to expand and boost communication, travel, business, things that Mercury represents. And then Jupiter goes retrograde or Vakri. So Jupiter's going to get stronger, which is going to be nice because Jupiter will be stronger, the benefic energy, even though it's swamped, kind of like Mercury. Jupiter's swamped by Mars, Rahu, and Saturn right now. So it's making Jupiter's fighting the good fight, but I think it's dimming Jupiter's light with all the negative influence. Jupiter also represents optimism, so it might be hard to stay optimistic these days. September 8th, Jupiter has an exact aspect on Sun. So then it's almost like this Jupiter Mercury again, because this is right after our Labor Day in the United States, and a lot of schools are just starting or just started about this time of the year for the fall term. Jupiter represents teacher, Sun represents authority or parent. It might be if there was an incident, teacher-student incident, that maybe authority or parents are getting involved. Another storyline could be spirituality, which Jupiter represents, versus work. Like, how do you integrate those? It could also be the law versus the president. So, who knows? We might hear more things about President Biden here in the United States or whichever country you reside in, or maybe it's the head or president of your company, that sort of thing. Be some issues there. And then September 19th, Mars has an exact aspect on Jupiter. I mentioned that previously. So again, we're going to bring some initiative, action to bring justice or balance to this. So again, if this is a running storyline and there was like a teacher-student run-in and then the parents or authorities come in to mediate or referee or whatever they're going to do, and then it looks like it might take a little bit of time, but then there's going to be some action to bring justice to the situation. Again, if we were going to link all these together in one story. So the moon, we had September 14th, we have a new moon in Leo Simha, so more Leo energy in Uttara Phalguni. Again, the hammock, so enjoyment with a purpose, that nakshatra. Leo is friendly to moon, so moon does well there. It's a fixed fire sign I mentioned before. It's also because the sun's going to be there. This is going to be a sun-dominated moon. So issues of authority and work purpose are going to be part of this new moon. Again, usually when there's a new moon or full moon, because the moon represents the emotional mind, there's usually some emotional energy that comes about or comes to the surface, or epiphany, that sort of thing can happen. The moon's going to be conjoined with the sun and Mercury, and it's going to be aspected by Saturn, Jupiter, Rahu. So the moon, the emotional mind, is going to be wrapped up in this energy web. And the moon can represent things like a mother or woman or a nurturing figure, that kind of energy. So especially just based on what we talked about with Jupiter and that potentially Jupiter student situation, this might be somebody stepping in to help smooth things over in that situation. And again, Uttara Phalguni, it's an nakshatra that represents like earning money through learning, being popular, comfort, luxury, patronage, favors, kindness, eagerness to help others and alleviate suffering. So especially when we have a new moon, or the moon, again representing a nurturing figure, wanting to help smooth things over and kind of complete the cycle, right? Complete the cycle of this energy. All right, and then we have on September 29th, full moon in Pisces or Mina. Bless you. Sorry, my dog just sneezed. Uttara Bhadrapada, nakshatra. So Pisces is a neutral sign for moon. It's a dual water sign. So John Lennon, we just talked about Pisces. Um, and it's also the natural 12th house in the natural zodiac. So the natural zodiac is when you have the first constellation in the first house. So that would be an Aries lugna. And that represents the global birth chart if there was one. But the Pisces is the Rashi or constellation for the 12th house, which represent things like temples and isolation, sort of thing. Places places of isolation. It can also represent, other places of isolation could be like prisons, hospitals, that sort of thing. Um, there's going to be a mutual aspect with Mars because Mars is in Virgo, directly across the pyramid. So this will create what we call a Chandra Mangala yoga. Chandra Mangala yoga, it's a planetary combination that represents things like money. So that might be a good time for a few dollars coming your way, or rupees or pounds or francs, euros, I guess, wherever you live in the world. And the thing though is that there's this Uttara Pradrapada, the symbol of that is the back legs of a funeral pyre. So there's something that's ending here that's being released. The deity of this nakshatra is, I never pronounce it correctly, Ahir Budinya? Budnya? Ahir Budnya, I think that's how it is. Ahir Budnya, which is a serpent of the deep. So there's this like snake-like energy. So especially when you have snakes combined with like places of isolation, this nakshatra can symbolize things like people who are happy and good speakers, virtuous, victorious, benevolent. So it's a high-minded nakshatra, self-sacrificing. But then you're getting at more of the second part of this energy of secrecy, solitude, kundalini energy, spiritual evolution, devotees, insight, erudition, awareness, charitableness. Again, because of the money thing, renunciates creators. So I was really getting more of like a kind of a spiritual religious vibe from this, especially because it's a full moon. I think there's a lot of mental, emotional energy, um, getting clear, and moving forward in a benevolent way. Because the only thing on the moon here is Mars, and Mars is trying to clean things up in Virgo, right? Trying to put things together, um, organize details in Virgo. But it's out of the fray, kind of like Venus temporarily. It's out of the fray of this whole Saturn, Jupiter, Rahu, Mercury, Sun mix. So this with the moon being out of the way, it can get clearer, I think. Especially when you step away from all the hurly burly activity and you start to really consider um, what your spiritual and soul needs are, and soul and spiritual direction moving forward, rather than, because again, there's all this, Sun, Mars, all these, and Jupiter's in there, but again, Jupiter's getting swamped. So it's like, how do we get our minds clear to bring back peace, bring back spirituality, bring back a higher perspective on all of this activity, because there is going to be a lot of activity going on. And this might actually be a really good way to set our minds or bring our minds to before the eclipses happen next month. So, taking some time out to meditate or unplug from the internet or what have you, whatever your mode or way of doing that in a spiritual, religious way might be what's called for and most beneficial at that time. All right, so our last celebrity chart here. This is Sir Winston Churchill. And if you noticed, the first two charts I did the John Lennon first and then Pele, and I didn't realize at the time when I chose these charts, but they're fairly, I see a relationship because they're only a few weeks away when they were born. But actually, John Lennon, his middle name's Winston, and his middle name was actually chosen because of Winston Churchill, who was prime minister at the time. So I didn't realize that either when I first chose the charts until I started reading their biographies. But I thought that was kind of cool. Anyway, this is Sir Winston Churchill. So he was prime minister of the UK a couple of times, and yeah. So this is another chart. That I wasn't really sure if it was his or not, but anyway, I found a chart that I think works for him, based on what I think what's closer to his real birth date. His official birth date is 30th November 1874, 1:30 a.m. Woodstock, UK. But in the notes, when you look at that, look for that on the internet, it says from memory. So, the reason why I did not choose that time, and I thought it was a time problem, I didn't think it was a date problem, although you never know, was because if you chose 1:30, that would make him somebody who loved religion in childhood. um, because I think, if I remember correctly, yeah, because that would make him a Virgo Lugna, actually. If you spun this chart to 1:30, because what happens is it brings, because Venus retrograde aspects his own house of Taurus, and at 1:30 in the morning, Taurus would be his ninth house. Um, and he was anti-religion. So I was like, that doesn't make sense. I mean, when I just saw that, I was like, I don't think this is his chart. Because he thought it was irrational and that sort of thing. So, like, they literally in the notes of his bio, they said he was violently opposed to like religion. So I was like, okay, this is not his chart. Um, so I thought it's probably another Lugna. I didn't mess with the day, but I was like, what other Lugna on November 30th made sense for who he was and the history of him. Well, he was born into a wealthy family. His father supported the military. He encouraged Winston to go into the military. And Winston also had his first child in July of 1909. Um, so those are some things about his bio that again helped me choose a chart. And then I also use a Samaya chart, so that's an update chart. Um, you cast that when you start analyzing somebody's chart to kind of update their energy. And in the Samaya chart, he was an Aries or Mesha Lugna, and he had yeah. So I was like, okay, let me look at that. Let me look at the Aries Lugna and see if that works for this day. So I think it does because this Venus retrograde aspecting into its own sign, into the second house here, that would give him a wealthy family, a wealthy upbringing, um, instead of a lover of religion, which he would have been before. The other thing is Mars here is in his sixth house, and Mars represents things like enemies and rebelliousness and things like that, and so and military. And Mars aspects his ninth house of father, but also religion. So that would give him a violent opposition to religion. And it'd also make his father military supporter, and a military guy. So that made sense. Also his first child I mentioned. So July 1909, his first child was born. If you use this chart, Jupiter was transiting his fifth house of children in 1909. And especially for the first child, when Jupiter is aspecting or transiting the fifth house, that's usually an indication that a child could be born. So I think the Aries Lugna works pretty well for him. So if you change his birth time to 1405 to 1507, that hour period, you do get an Aries Lugna for him. And he was also born into Venus. So not only does this Venus retrograde aspecting into the second house help him with money and give him a wealthy family that he was born into, but it's going to give him the eloquence to be this phenomenal, uh, historically renowned figure for speech. Not just public speeches, but he was also an author. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature besides being prime minister for, I mean, I was like, I didn't know all that about him. So I was like, wow, he's a pretty impressive guy. Besides just, saving Europe and dealing with the Nazi forces and that sort of thing. So, let's look at this house by house. So, first house, we have an Aries or Mesha Lugna ruled by Mars. So, again, a lot about Mars now, rebellious, innovator, military, fiery. Mars has gone to the sixth house of enemies. So, this is somebody who would be an innovator, CEO type, hands-on type, military enemies. Aries is also a movable fire sign, so somebody's going to be very active. And then he has a Rahu there in Ashwini. Ashwini is a nakshatra that's represented by the Kumara twins, the celestial healers. Typically, when I see Ashwini, there's a lot of activity, being first, wanting to be first. There's also, there can also be a savior complex, which I think he had. Mars is in Chitra, Jupiter's in Chitra. Chitra is, I mentioned before, Chitra is represented by a gemstone, and it's the deity associated with that is the celestial architect. And he was an architect. He was architect of society and the architect of military, architect of books, architect of society. And then he has Mercury here in Vishaka. So you have two speaking planets and education, writing, publication planets on his Lugna. So not only was he Rahu ambitious, Mars military person, Mars CEO, Mars commander in chief, but he was also Jupiter Mercury educated speaker writer, published, all of that. So that makes a lot of sense the way this all lines up. So again, ambition, and also because Mars aspects into the first house from the sixth house, that's going to give this even more strength here and even more fire. Yeah. So, strength of body, strength of mind, strength of personality. So yeah, all of that. First house that fits. Second house, I mentioned Venus retrograde, Swa and Jesta. Jesta can be represented by as a by a talisman as a nakshatra, and it can represent things like um, kind of more psychic type things, but also like law enforcement, which essentially he is commander in chief of the military of the UK. He was he was that. But with this retrograde SWAT, this Venus, he's gonna be able to eloquently talk about all these military things. And then he has Sun aspect in the second house, so he's gonna be the king, literally. I mean, more or less, literally, not the king, like not king of England, but figurehead or head of England. Is pretty similar. In Anuradha is a nakshatra that's symbolized also like Vishaka, like with it's symbolized by a victory triumph arch, but Vishaka can come with it the energy of winning at all costs, despite any damage to relationships and things like that. Whereas Anuradha is a bridge builder. So, I mean, this is somebody who speaks like somebody who wants to build bridges and bring society back together. Gifted, eloquent, effective speaker. Yeah, that's what we get here. The fifth house, we have Leo ruled by the sun. So again, this is going to be his mind, his intellect, ruled by the sun and Anuradha. So a figurehead who's effective at building bridges and being successful there. Yeah. And he has the moon here in Purva Phalguni, so somebody who like to enjoy um, um, life. I think he did. Um, but who was also like had a purpose in terms of advising the public as a leader, as a public leader. He had that on his mind, and he enjoyed it. He enjoyed advising the public or advising about the public and the masses. Like, how do we help people, help countries, right? But he was thinking at that level. The sixth house I mentioned briefly, Mars is there. Mars is a planet that represents enemies, and it's in the house of enemies, and he had plenty of those, I'm sure, with all the politics and, military engagements he had. The seventh house, we have Jupiter, Mercury, Saturn, Saturn is Swa, um, is Swa in the 10th house of career. So that's, Saturn is perseverance. It's also bureaucracy. And then that Swa Saturn is aspecting into the seventh house, which is ruled by Libra here. And Saturn is one exalted in Libra. And it's also, Saturn has Digbal or directional strength in the seventh house. So you have this massive Saturn on Mercury, K2, Jupiter. So he wrote, so when you have Mercury and Jupiter, which are speaking, writing, publishing, and then you have Saturn on it, this is him writing about his military and historical things, and that's what he got the Nobel Prize in Literature for. Um, and I wrote here, he got the Nobel Prize in Literature while he was running his Saturn Mercury period. He was kind of on the cusp there. Saturn is when they announced that he won it, and Saturn Mercury is when he actually they had a ceremony. So the Saturn Mercury, and again, Saturn being in its own sign in the 10th house, that's what we call a Shasha Yoga. I mean, I'll get to that, but it's called a Shasha Yoga. It's a Raj Yoga or a yoga planetary combination that's indicative of they call it a royal yoga or yoga of power, which he clearly had. So the eighth house, we have Sun and Venus here. I mentioned Sun and Venus. So in deep psychology, this is a guy all about winning, a good cop, a leader. That's all there. That's just, again, we see the Sun and Anurata in the deep psychology. We have the Sun and Anurata aspecting the speech. In the second house, we have Sun and Anurata ruling the fifth house of intellect. So, luckily he was so well-minded. The ninth house, I mentioned, we have Mars and Sag. So again, this is going to be a CEO, military, and government, father, anti-religion. And also he became PM, UK PM the first time during Jupiter, Mercury, Moon, Rahu. Why do I have all this here? Because it's going to light up his first house and it's going to light up his fifth house of intellect. Yeah. So Jupiter, this benevolence, Mercury, speech, communications, Moon, public, Rahu, ambition. That's where all of this is going to kind of coalesce when he became UK PM the first time. The 10th house, I mentioned that's Saturn Swa in Shravana. So he was a listener. Not only was a speaker, but he was a listener. Also, Shravana tends to indicate people who are quite educated, which he was, and it's going to be in Capricorn. So he's going to be able to traverse a lot of bureaucracy. He's going to have perseverance. He's and in practical matters. Besides again the Shasha Yoga that he has, and then the 12th house he has is aspected by Saturn and Mars. So Mars from the 6th house, Saturn from the 10th house. So he's going to have a lot of cunning hidden enemies, which again isn't surprising. And again, because of his history, like it's kind of funny. Even I tried to just pick out a few key things because he was so all over the place. It seemed like every 6 months he was doing something new. He was with some new parties would form up and break up and all this sort of thing. It was hard to keep track of it. And that's very much a Mars combination because Mars is erratic. They're back and forth. And also what we call a fire, movable fire sign, Achara Rashi. Like they're always moving, always on the go. Da, da, da. I mean, this guy never slowed down. It seemed like. I mean, his whole career, and I think he lived till he was about 90. Um, so yeah, I mean, pretty amazing. So that's Winston Churchill. And if you're interested in more info, I did look at the national chart for the UK, a couple of them in different periods of history on the UK. Um, I believe it was last October, November. So if you look for my transit videos in October, November of 2022, I have the UK national charts. I also looked at Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss since they're recent PMs for the UK. So if you want to compare and contrast it all, that's available. But again, you can see here that we have Mars in Virgo, like we currently have. Um, uh, we have this Mercury, Jupiter, Rahu combination. We have a strong Saturn. Um, so there's still some relationship with the current sky pattern going on. You get the other six, so 410 axis, 511 axis, 612 axis. So yeah, so if you're wondering, okay, that's all the planetary aspects, all nice and fine, but what does it mean for me? This will give you a little bit more indication of what it means, which parts of your life are going to be affected in what ways. Yeah. So that's it. That's Vedic astrology transits Jyotish for September 2023. As always, I appreciate your time and your interest, and I appreciate your support for the channel. All of my Vedic astrology teaching videos are in my concepts playlist if you're interested in learning more. I do individual birth chart readings on Zoom, so if that's of interest, you can email heartlightastra@yahoo.com. I do have another YouTube channel on natural medicine, including other Vedic arts like Ayurveda and yoga, as well as homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. That channel is called Nature Source Care. So, as always, I hope you found this interesting, educational, and helpful as you navigate the different planetary energy cycles of your life. And I wish you all the best. Take care until the next one. Namaste.